Hi, everyone. I'm David Way. I'm your moderator for this event. I know that there are still people who are filtering in, but in any case, I think we should get started. Let me thank first Climeworks for hosting this particular discussion on an important topic, from carbon neutral to net zero. A very little bit about me first. I lead the climate change team at BSR, or Business for Social Responsibility. It's a global nonprofit that works with our 270 member companies to build a just and sustainable world. We only work on corporate sustainability here, and we have done so for almost 30 years. And we have worked with many of our member companies to select, validate, and implement climate goals, including net zero goals. And I think that's part of what brings at least my voice or me here and why I'm so pleased to be moderating this discussion. I'm just going to begin with a few remarks and then set out the format for you and then get right into it. It's been only 2 years since the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, which was published in October 2018. One of that report's conclusions was that no matter which global pathway we follow to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to reach net zero global emissions by 2050. And since then, the number of net zero corporate targets has proliferated. 2 weeks ago, UNFCCC's Race to Zero campaign announced a doubling of the number of companies committed to net zero, now at about 1,100 companies. Some examples, in very recent examples, 2 weeks ago, Walmart announced a goal of reaching zero emissions across global operations, interestingly, without offsets. Unilever, maybe just 2 months back, announced a goal to have net zero products by 2039. This particular trend is true of states as well. Look, for example, at the European Commission's proposal in March to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. And of course, the almost surprise unilateral announcement from the Chinese president, Xi, that China will aim to be carbon neutral before 2060. And so underneath this theme, though, there are some big questions, and the IPCC's special report sort of revealed some of these. For example, that report looked at 4 illustrative pathways to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. In the first, cumulative carbon capture and sequestration in this century was 0 gigatons. In the second, 348 gigatons. In the third, 687 gigatons. And in the fourth, 1,218 gigatons captured and sequestered in this century. That is more than 1 trillion tons. And this tells us, at a minimum, that carbon dioxide removal methods and technologies must be on the table to reach a 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And in the landscape, there are other efforts, many efforts that foresee this. I'm just going to point out 2 of them as examples. Look, for example, to the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, acronymed C2G2, which is exploring good governance of carbon dioxide removal technologies, also at the international level. Or, for example, the work that is now underway of the Task Force on Scaling Up Voluntary Carbon Markets. That task force, I think, will publish its work early next year, similar to that of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And that work is premised on the idea that the voluntary carbon markets need to scale up by about 15 times if we are going to reach the Paris Agreement goals. Companies, too, are looking at this particular question. I'll take as an example Microsoft's climate commitments. It made a commitment among many in January to be carbon negative by 2030. Microsoft's projected pathway relies almost entirely on carbon removal as opposed to avoided emissions offsets. And so I think we're very lucky today to speak with several experts on this particular subject. And so let me briefly introduce them, and they're also more than welcome during the discussion to say more about themselves. Jennifer Wilcox is professor of chemical engineering and energy policy at the University of Pennsylvania and a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute. She's also presidential and distinguished as a professor. You should watch her TED Talk if you have not already. Her expertise is in chemical engineering and its application, and her work focuses on carbon management techniques, including removal from the atmosphere. She is the author of the first ever text on carbon capture, published in 2012, which seems a very long time ago actually now, even though it is not. Misha Retman is Senior Environmental Management Specialist at Swiss Re He has a PhD in process engineering and an MSc in environmental physics. And he continues to be a lecturer at the University ETH Zurich. He may even be the inventor of the Swiss Re slogan, "Do our best and remove the rest." And he can tell us if that is the case very shortly. Nan Ransohoff is climate lead at Stripe, a payments technology company. As the climate lead at BSR, I'm absolutely delighted to see that there can be climate leads at companies. Her previous experience was on product at Neuro, a robotics company, and at Uber. And last but not least is Daniel Egger, head of marketing and sales at Climeworks. His background is in engineering, previously with ABB. This tells us that we have a lot of engineering background, actually, and expertise in play today. My own expertise is not in engineering. I'm a lawyer and a diplomat, and therefore I may feel actually woefully understaffed very shortly. In terms of our format, we intend to have a dialogue for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then have about 20 minutes of Q&A from you, the audience. During the dialogue, we'll try to move slowly from the big picture issues towards company implementation and solutions. I do want to ask you to please get your questions ready. Ask them anytime. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, and I encourage you just to put your questions there. I promise I will try to get them out to the panelists and to cover them. We really encourage a lively debate. We also have the pleasure of a designer, Nina, who will be live drawing the event. Nina, I'm going to ask you to show your slide. We can do live drawing even in virtual events these days. And so Nina, if you could share a slide just so that Nina will show her slide perhaps 3 to 4 times during the course of the discussion. And then you'll be able to see some lovely illustration. I also should note before we get started that we are recording this particular event for the benefit of future audiences, just as the audience, please know that. So with that, let's get started with the discussion. So my first questions really are to Jennifer, and I encourage everyone to jump in always. I spoke about a couple of illustrative pathways that the IPCC has used that will reach 1.5 degrees Celsius, and they cross net zero global emissions at 2050. I guess I want to ask you, in your view, what's the role of removal in these global trajectories, and what trade-offs do you see in deploying removal technologies globally at that kind of scale? The numbers are really sometimes staggering.
Yes. Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here. So thinking about the role that carbon removal plays, one thing I'll also mention is that in addition to the IPCC report that you mentioned, there were recently 2 other reports too. One that was released by the Royal Society on greenhouse gas removal, and another one that was from the US National Academy of Sciences on the role of CDR and carbon dioxide removal, and then establishing a research agenda. And both of those reports also state that we need carbon removal in order to reach our climate goals. And so the role that carbon removal plays, I think, as we can imagine, having passed to carbon neutrality, there are sectors that are really difficult to avoid. So transportation sector is one of those. So thinking about when we fly planes and trying to avoid those carbon emissions. Other sectors include the industrial sector. So when we make cement and steel, it's very difficult to think of replacement pathways for those materials, and they inherently release CO2. And not just from fossil fuels, but they release it because, for instance, when you make cement, you're heating up limestone to really high temperatures, and the carbon is inherent in that feedstock. Another sector that's really difficult is the agricultural sector. And so there are other greenhouse gas emissions that aren't CO2, but still have a significant warming potential, and in fact, higher warming. And so carbon removal can also help to offset those emissions. The other aspect that's important is the fact that we're just not doing deep decarbonization or avoiding the carbon emissions in the first place fast enough. 10 years ago, the models were different, and that deep decarbonization and avoiding carbon emissions were enough to meet climate goals, but we're no longer in that position. And so we need to do things faster. And so the idea is that CO2 in the atmosphere, it lasts a long time. And so we have to, if we're not going to do deep decarbonization fast enough, then carbon removal and starting carbon removal now could potentially be at the scale we actually need it to be after mid-century. The other thing I think that I just want to point out about the role is that it's not to reach net zero. It's not just about today's emissions and avoiding them. It's also about legacy emissions. It's about everything that we've been dumping and accumulating in the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution. We're fortunate enough to have the terrestrial biosphere and the ocean take care of half of our mess every year, but it's really at the expense of the oceans. And we see that in ocean acidification. I think a lot of people don't realize, and I've only realized myself a few years ago, understanding the climate science even more, is that it takes roughly 1,000 years for the ocean to fully circulate. And what that means is there are parts of the ocean ecosystem that do not or have not seen today's CO2 concentrations. And so if the oceans stand a chance, we really have to take that carbon back out of the atmosphere. And really the only way to deal with that, again, if we don't do deep decarbonization fast enough, and we haven't been, is carbon removal. And then to answer the question on trade-offs, I would look at it differently. I don't see these things as competing. I see deep decarbonization, avoiding carbon emissions, and carbon removal being able to work together. And I think that, you know, working together does require strong policy, so that we can prioritize the limited resources that are out there. Limited resources meaning land, low carbon energy resources. There needs to be a hierarchy of how these limited resources are used, whether they're for avoiding carbon or whether they're for removing carbon from the atmosphere. And I think that's where policy could play a strong role.
That's really helpful. I want to ask just a quick follow-up, really to yourself, Jennifer, and also to Misha and Nan. I think it's something that is sort of occurs to many environmentalists, and it's the question of moral hazard. I mean, the question is really, how do you, and you've spoken a little bit about this idea of them working together, how do you contain this moral hazard, the thought that removal will remove from our attention or effort from reduction and abatement?
I can start, and I feel that talking about moral hazards is a moral hazard because it gives us something to talk about. And I feel like we're done talking. You know, I feel like there's a lot of work to be done. And I don't think we've hit the intersection of moral hazards yet. It's not like we are using low carbon energy resources irresponsibly yet. And so I think that it just feels like it's slowing down our progress. I think you're right if we were to do things really fast, but we're not doing anything very fast at all today. But again, I think that the role that policy could play is very important. I think that citing projects is really important to be able to recognize cultural differences in regions. For instance, you know, the acceptance of some low carbon energy resources over others. In some regions, nuclear is okay. In other regions, it's not okay. And in some regions, it's okay to put CO2 in the ground through geologic storage, through enhanced oil recovery. In other regions, that's not okay. And so I think it's really important to understand what's acceptable in certain cultures and regions. And it's a bit of a puzzle. That's why we haven't kind of figured this out yet. But I don't think that these two things have to compete.
A big plus one to that. I think historically we have thought about this as an either or, and really it's a yes and. We're going to have to do both. And that is also true of so many quote unquote competing technologies on the emissions reduction side. It's not, you know, either solar or nuclear. It's yes and. And I think that sort of thinking about climate as there's this singular bullet that's going to solve the problem isn't doing us any favors, and we're going to have a portfolio of solutions, and carbon removal has to, unfortunately at this point, play a really big role in that.
Misha, do you want to weigh in? Up to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks, Climeworks, for the invitation, first of all. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I can only underline what's been said, right? So in our bubble, that thinking is kind of accepted. I would just be mindful that it's not only us, right? And there are, you know, people really who believe that this is mitigation deterrence and we should not do that. And they are kind of fed by by impression of stakeholders in the industry, for example, who say, "Oh, nice, we just do the one and we leave out the other." At Swiss Re, it was very important for us from the beginning to really have both sides of the coin. We do our best to reduce whatever we can, and then we do removals. And it's not we do removals because we can afford them, because that's really a pitfall for us as well, and we have to be really mindful to listen to those who have this concern. Although we believe, yes, we need it and we need both, and it's important, and removals, they also give you a good incentive to do more reduction in the first place, because they are more expensive than doing some other types of compensation.
Yeah, Thano, thanks very much for that. I think I want to follow up a bit with Nan and Misha about the role that removals play in corporate targets. So I mentioned that now I think 1,100 companies, according to the Race to Zero campaign, have support or have made net zero commitments. I anticipate that will rise, I don't know, to 5,000 by the time COP26 rolls around next November. I want to ask you a couple of, I'm not going to ask you 3 questions at once, and I'm sorry they're related. And so I will throw them all at the two of you all at once. The first is what you think the role of offsets is when a company takes a net zero target. The second is what role you think removals has. I understand that removals is sort of a subset of offsets. And then a third that I think Jennifer sort of spoke to a little bit in before, which is that it's not just about today's emissions, but about legacy emissions. And it made me think that there are 2 companies recently, I think, that have tried to address legacy emissions. The first, I think, is Microsoft, which in January announced it would try to remove all of its legacy emissions since its founding, and do that by 2050, if I'm correct. So I hope there's no one from Microsoft on the line who will shoot me for misstating that date. And the second, I think, is Procter & Gamble, actually, who I believe 2 weeks ago also announced that it would use offsets to remove everything in its sort of historical footprint. I'm just tacking on this curiosity about what you think legacy emissions can have sort of in a corporate net zero goal. But really my question is about offsets and removals and their role in corporate net zero goals, which we are seeing more and more.
May I make a first comment?
Yeah, of course.
The 1,000 comments with a net zero commitment, already there it starts to be a bit fussy and blurry, unfortunately. So we kept our own compilation of net zero commitments, and my interns would always follow that very diligently. And so we have the database, and what we check first is, do they talk removal or not? So what does it mean for them to be net zero? Is it enough to do reductions only, right? So I replace my fleet with EV, or I change the boiler here and there. Then is it enough to take conventional carbon avoidance offsets to compensate my emissions? Or do they actually talk about sequestering the carbon that they are responsible for? So the residual emissions being removed. And really, I think not even half of those that we have on our list talk removals. They stop somewhere earlier. And I think it's very important now, the SBTI paper makes that point clearly. Net zero would mean that you balance all residual emissions with the equivalent amount of removals. And this is not what quite a lot of those net zero commitments entail. Now, SBTI at the same time does a mess by saying climate neutral is the same as net zero, and then they confuse the examples. But just to mention, it's not net zero doesn't mean net zero for everyone. We have to be careful there.
Yeah, I think offsets is a really loaded term. It's become such a loaded term, and so many people sort of define it in different ways. If we zoom out a little bit, I think there are 2 main levers here. We can either stop emitting in the first place, or we can take the carbon we already put into the air and store it somewhere, ideally permanently. And we have to do both aggressively. And I think that ideally corporate climate programs are moving towards pulling both of those levers. And sort of asterisks. Offsets can fall into both of those buckets. They can either fall into the form of avoided emissions reduction, or they can fall into the form of carbon removal. But I think in general, when we look at both of those levers, carbon removal has been really underinvested in relative to the scale of the solutions that we're going to need. And I think at Stripe, we really believe that companies can play a huge role in accelerating how quickly we scale the technologies that we need to hit the global targets. By 2050, by 2100, Where do we need to be? Where are we today? How do we fill in those gaps? And what's the role that companies can actually play in accelerating that? I'll wait till maybe your next questions to get into the role of companies specifically in removals. But the short answer is I think that, companies can help in both emissions reduction and carbon removal. Historically, companies haven't played as big a role in carbon removal. And I think there's a huge opportunity for companies to sort of expand their commitments into that space going forward.
And maybe to quickly come back to the legacy question. I mean, this is the case for removals, right? There is no tackling of legacy emissions with reductions. So therefore, and climate science tells us we need those negative emissions at so big scales, large scales, that we rather start now than tomorrow to build that capacity. And if companies are speaking that same language, that's very important. So I commend Microsoft for bringing that to the table very early and saying, we're actually looking into our legacy emissions as well. Because as a world, we're going to have to do that after 2050, right? It doesn't stop with the world being at net zero by 2050 thing. It's about being net negative for the entire second half of the century. And that's when we need those negative emissions. And how much we're going to need really then depends on how fast we are in reducing in the first place.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. And you can see, you mentioned, Misha, this Science-Based Targets Initiative paper. I believe the title is Foundations for Net Zero Corporate Target Setting. And it's a white paper that explores, it was released 2 weeks ago, that tries to sort of bring some standardization to the question of net zero corporate targets. Also, I see at least 3 audience questions already asking why there is not a clear definition of what net zero means, and asking in effect for clarification of and standardization of the terminology. I wanted to ask sort of where you think this sort of question on sort of standards and frameworks to these particular targets or to the question of removals sort of stands today, and what is needed going forward. So the question of what kind of clarification in terms of standards or frameworks may be needed going forward. And I'm curious if any of you, I'm happy to throw this question to all of you. It seems very clear that, frankly, that corporate net zero targets need standardization, and hopefully that that SBTi effort will begin to bring that. But I'm curious what else might be on the table or in your minds. Daniel, did you want to jump in? Yeah,
I'm happy to start with this. I think in the first a bit, standardization is one thing, and education is the other thing. Of course, standardization helps to speak a common language, which is important to get this understood. But on the other hand, it's also important that we find a way to bring this message into the corporates and to raise the awareness between the difference of these different concepts. And how to do that? Basically, I mean, we need to talk about it. We need to form communities to exchange. We need to form communities who can support others and share experiences. And I think this is what's important now. It is, I mean, from a definition point of view, I think it can be solved. Of course, standards are needed that we have a common understanding how this is applied. And I would appreciate that if this could be led by corporates as Swiss Re or as Stripe to start those discussions, and also lead by example and to show to others how this can be done. I mean, the transparency Stripe has brought into this entire topic. I think this is exactly what is needed, that people and corporates start to understand how to deal with this topic. And I think probably this is one of the first steps to make it transparent and share experience how to tackle such a topic.
Yeah, anyone else have thoughts on this?
Well, I can weigh in a little bit. I think one thing that's difficult in this space too, in terms of carbon removal, is the various approaches. And so we have a lot of different ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and how that carbon is locked away so that it's actually truly removal is an important consideration. And so if you are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, say from direct air capture or bioenergy with carbon capture, and you permanently store it in a dedicated, geologic formation deep in the earth. In the United States, we've been doing that since 1972 was the first project. The CO2 has never leaked. We've never had an accident. Unfortunately, we've recovered a lot of oil from that process too, because it's how we get more oil out of the ground is through CO2 enhanced oil recovery with carbon dioxide. But the point is we know how to do it. We know how to measure it. We understand verification, monitoring, leakage of that CO2. But what about in soils? You know, when you say I'm going to do zero tillage agriculture, how do we ensure that that carbon is really stored, and for what time period and how much? Can we quantify that? The other pieces, you know, as we see in what's happening in the Pacific Northwest and in California right now with all the wildfires, and so we think that the CO2 is going to be stored in forests and when we plant trees, but there's this, you know, irreversibility, you know, that we cannot count on because of these kinds of events that are only going to increase as climate change increases. And so I think that trying to better, you know, develop methods for verifying the storage, the durability of the storage on what time scale, so that we can kind of compare across all of the different approaches, because today they're not really treated equally. And they also have very different costs, you know, to do each one, which is a whole other factor. But I'm not answering the question very well. I'm probably just presenting that it's a complicated space, and this is exactly where we're at right now.
Very helpful. Misha, now it's up to you. Do you want to jump in on this? Or?
No, I think it will be all about standards, and that people, now we are kind of a bunch of the few first movers, right? It's like 50 who go out in public and talk a lot about it, although we have quite some commitments already. I think it's about the 3,000, 5,000 after us that will have to not go through the same and do everything publicly, and try to build scientific committees to do that from scratch, like Stripe had to do, or like Microsoft is doing. So the knowledge sharing is key, and with that comes proper standardization. And the standard bodies, the usual suspects, were a bit slow, right? They were overtaken by 2018 IPCC came out. What do we do? And then it took some years to come out with those position papers, and then it quite often it's too complicated for people to simply get a clear, okay, that's in and that's out kind of advice on corporate climate action. That's a problem. What I think is important for us at this point is always say what we mean. So therefore, I would never go out and without my slogan in the backpack and say we do our best and remove the rest. This is important to us. It's close to our heart. It explains what we want to do, and it also shows our priorities. And everybody knows we talk removals, and we have not forgotten about reduction.
Super. Now I'll move on, and then you can jump in whenever you like. My next question actually is Melissa Vernon's question from the audience, more or less, which is how do you balance her question is how do you balance the extremely high cost and low volumes of removal projects available today with getting voluntary action at scale? And this really points to the question of what you need to make this commercially viable, and what size of market, what do you need to have the scale of impact that we are eventually seeking? It's an important question. I think I'm gonna throw it over to Daniel first before others comment.
When we're talking about this scale-up question, we're basically talking about developing a technology which is able to be scaled up. So cracking the technology code, and the other side to create a market which is big enough, and also to create a healthy market. And this is basically cracking the market code. For the market side, and that's my background as coming from sales. I mean, we need to create a demand side, and we also need to create a supply side. And in the best situation, we would scale this up together. What we have learned now from Nan and Misha is how the demand side can look like. And on the other side, on our side, is now that we provide the supply side and the standards. This is one aspect of this, but it's also to create the market mechanisms, to create the business cases which can deal with this topic. And and size is definitely of importance. I mean, we need to have a certain size to make it happen. On the other side, I mean, the supply side for the time being is still somehow limited. So we would not be able to deliver billions of tons of removals already by today. So in the first step, we need to have niche markets which are able to develop these market mechanisms, these business cases. And I think this we have today with all the companies we have already been mentioned today. Here we're talking about a couple of thousand tons, maybe a couple of 10,000 tons to create and to start with it. To really make it commercially viable, we definitely need to further scale it up, and then we're probably talking about a couple of 100 millions of tons, which are needed to create market mechanisms which are also working at scale. But what is important here is we're talking about an entirely new market, and we need to do it step by step. And we also need to understand that the market mechanisms we have today are not meant to also work in 10 years from today. And this also needs time, this needs experience. And for this, I mean, what we simply need today are, beside investments, of course, into technologies, regulatory framework, what Jennifer already mentioned, we also simply need purchase agreements to start to learn how to act in this market. And this is basically how we see that. And we need to take care that all of this is basically more or less in parallel, so that also that we can somehow balance the risk. I mean, if we have, for example, regulations which we cannot cover with the market mechanisms, then we also have a risk that this regulation is not going to work. For example, if the price on carbon is simply too low, then we cannot scale, because there is not enough money to cover the initial costs. And all this needs to be balanced, and this is important for the time being.
I'll piggyback there, because I think this is a really excellent question and gets to the heart of the matter in a lot of the carbon removal space. You know, as you highlighted, the technologies, there are many technologies today that are really promising, that have the potential to be really low cost, high permanence, high volume in the future. But the problem is that they are too expensive today that you could sort of put, that most companies could reasonably pay for per ton. And you know, the way that we thought about it at Stripe, we first looked to other industries to look for analogs. And you see this happen in solar, in smartphones, in TVs, where technologies start off as really expensive, but over time, as volume goes up and as companies gain experience from manufacturing, the cost of these technologies goes down. And when we made when Stripe made its carbon removal commitment last August, the spirit was really to help these new technologies get down the cost curve and get up the volume curve. And the way that we approached that was, we said, we are not going to solve for the number of tons removed today. We're going to pay at any price. We'll pay any price per ton, but we want to choose technologies that we think have the potential to be low cost and high volume in the future. So we sort of looked at what the potential might be in 2050 and said, well, we're comfortable paying a higher price this year. We actually purchased from Climeworks. Climeworks was one of the 4 companies that we purchased from. And over time, we believe that if enough companies come together to take a similar approach, we can quickly get these companies down the cost of these technologies down that cost curve. To Daniel's point, a really important role that corporates can play here is becoming that demand side of the market. And part of the problem in carbon removal today is there aren't enough purchasers. So when companies like Climeworks are sort of considering, are we going to build a new plant? Are we going to expand? One of the questions that they'll ask themselves is, who's my customer? Who's going to pay for this? And corporates can play a really important role in being that customer to give the supply side the confidence that they need to build that new plant, to invest in scale, to sort of get up that volume curve. And I think that a big coalition of buyers for carbon removal has the potential to really accelerate progress here. And to Jen's point, we have to get the ball rolling. We don't have a ton of time, so how can we do that more quickly? Corporates, you know, this is an area I'm very passionate about, but I think corporates can play a huge role in accelerating that progress by making carbon removal commitments.
I'll ask another question.
Yeah, sure.
You go first, and then I have 2 follow-ups.
If I can, I would add one thing, because it's not that we should only become customers. We have to be a certain type of customers. And Daniel mentioned that actually. He was quite explicit. He needs purchase agreements. And this is something that should be very obvious to all of us who probably have dealt with power purchase agreements and getting renewable energy to scale. I think we all played a role there, right? Therefore, why not doing the same role model for carbon removal now? We need to find funding schemes that allow us to enter long-term off-taking agreements with those suppliers that actually render those projects bankable. Because without this guaranteed revenue stream, there will always be some kind of freaky thing in a new market that's not there yet and very difficult to assess. But with the solid 5 or 10 years long-term SERPA, carbon removal purchase agreement, you name it, that is what the industry needs now. So we first movers who are willing to pay the first mover price, and that's always a free rider problem. We will be those who pay the high price, and others will come after us and profit from the cost curve that comes down. So us first movers, we should use the money very wisely. So use our purchasing power, our willingness to bear those first mover costs very wisely.
Mm. I have 2 follow-up questions. I'm going to put them to Nan first, actually, a bit from what you've said. My first question is, so you try to assess technologies which have the potential to be low cost in the future. My question is, how did you make that choice? If you could just talk a bit about that. It seems like a really intriguing question and something you have experience on. My other question is that you've indicated a role for a leader that is, I think, different from how many companies, and maybe many companies on the line, see themselves as leaders. So your thought is that a leader, and I think Misha would agree with this, a leader is one that in effect brings the cost of technology down by investment at any price per ton, as long as there's high potential. This is not how many leaders, leading multinationals, look at their role on climate. They look at their role as buying the cheapest emissions reductions first to neutralize their own inventory, and that is how they look at it, thereby negating their own direct impact on the environment, on the atmosphere. And so I think I wanted to ask whether or not, I guess I'm just trying to say, do you, and I guess Misha, and maybe all of you, first, I'm just curious, how do you select those technologies in your own sort of experience? And then secondly, do you think we should redefine what the role of a leading company is then on climate?
Yep. I'll parse those 2. I'll answer the first question first. So when we were trying to figure out how to spend our own initial $1 million effectively, we came up with a set of criteria in conjunction with the help of a lot of experts, including Jen, to try to characterize the kinds of carbon removal solutions that are missing today that the world will need to hit the 2050, 2100 volumes necessary. And what we tried to do was for ourselves, lay out like what would a great solution look like. It has the potential to be high volume. So we came up, I think we used a 0.5 gigaton by 2040. It has the potential to be low cost, so less than $100 per ton by 2040. It has the potential to be permanent. So we specifically were looking at non-biospheric forms of sequestration. It is net negative. It is globally responsible. There's sort of all of these criteria that we laid out to say, this is what we're looking for. And it's okay if a solution doesn't look like that today, but we want to be able to make the case that it could look like that in the future, that it has the potential to look like that in the future. And like that again, the spirit was, let's characterize the gap of negative emission solutions today and try to look for solutions that could get there, and how can Stripe kind of accelerate that. So that was the lens that we used to come up with the criteria. Ultimately, we solicited a bunch of projects. They filled out a quite lengthy application. Our expert panel helped us evaluate those projects, and we ultimately ended up selecting 4. It was it was a challenging process. I mean, this is a complicated space, and we at Stripe are not ourselves experts, and had to sort of figure out how can we rely on many other folks to help us kind of figure out what's going on and make wise decisions, or as best we could. So hopefully that answers the question on criteria. In terms of like the role of companies, I wouldn't like leadership. I didn't mean to make a comment on sort of leadership writ large, and more saying that like early purchasers,
And I'm sorry to interrupt, just to be clear, I am making the comment on leadership writ large, so I'm posing the question. Go ahead.
I guess I think that it kind of depends on the lens that you're viewing it through. Like, there's one lens where companies are primarily trying to solve for their own circle of emissions and like deal with their circle of emissions. There's another world where you say, where companies' lenses change to how can I what is the largest climate impact I can have for every single dollar that I spend from a global perspective. And I think that if you take that lens of like, if I want to spend $1 and I want to maximize the chances that we are going to stay within the 1.5 degree target, how can I spend this dollar? The kinds of decisions that you make change a bit. And I think that what's been interesting with a lot of these larger commitments like Microsoft, there's a Microsoft, Amazon, there are these huge funds now that are going towards advancing technologies that are far outside of the scope of just their own emissions. What we're trying to do at Stripe, for example, is how can we make it easy for our 1 million+ businesses to make carbon removal commitments similar to our own? That is, outside of the scope of what just Stripe HQ is actually doing. So I think that what's going to be really interesting, and to me, there's a ton of opportunity here, is if we all assume the lens of time is running out, what can we do to help increase the chances that the world is going to hit this 1.5 degree target, or at least come somewhere in the ballpark of that? How can we use whatever resources are available to us most effectively? And I think that does change the tactics of what companies end up actually doing.
Super. Wonder if anyone else wants to chime in on either the sort of assessment of potential technologies or technology potential, or what company leadership might mean.
Just one comment. I think it's not a change of leadership that we are seeing here, or what you're seeing. We hear the leaders almost always, they are ahead of the actions, right? They go out and talk, and you can feel that it's close to their heart. I can certainly speak of our own CEO, Christian Mumenthaler, who is very vocal about, hey, what's the action that we need? What does it take to keep below 2 degrees? Tell me and show me how our business can contribute. And the case that we then brought with going net zero, and not only in the operations piece, very early on, it was clear for Swiss Re that we go business-wide net zero. That means also our insurance offerings and our investments become net zero in line with the world target. That was almost a no-brainer to put words into action. So then you also have to think of, is it then really just a shareholder and minimizing the cost of offsets? Or is it how to drive new things and maybe also open up new business opportunities, obviously, with carbon removal?
Cool. I want to go a little bit deeper now into sort of how a company strategy uses removals. So I'm going to ask Misha and if you could speak a bit, not just about how removals factor into your own climate goals and strategy, but sort of how you yourself weigh removals against avoided emissions or avoided offsets. I'm curious about whether or not internally, we at BSR, I know in my work with companies, whenever you are trying to do something, you need an internal validation, and you always need a case for that internal validation that will pass the threshold, that will pass with executives or leaders at the company. And so I'm curious if you faced any internal challenges and how you overcame them. And I ask these questions really because there will be companies in the audience who are thinking about today, what is the role? There are companies in the audience. They are designing their next generation climate and environmental strategies. They are here, and therefore they are thinking about what role removals might have in those particular strategies. And so really, I'm trying to see how I can get advice from the two of you, and also Jennifer and Dan, I'll definitely step in on how they might get the use of removals validated internally, and what your experience might teach them about that. Dan is passing to Misha.
I'm happy to go first. But yeah, go ahead, Misha.
Yeah, I would say it's a new story. Okay, that's to put that up front. It's new. So what is net zero? How do we get there? What are negative emissions? What are the solutions that get us there? Is it filtering CO2 from the atmosphere? That sounds like crazy. So it's new, but it's not too difficult to understand once you have somebody who tells you what the principles are. I had hundreds of talks within the company that explains the 101 of carbon removal and the basics of net zero. And that was never difficult to convey the message. And then we had people who are bought into that. That's the educational piece that also Daniel mentioned. I can really just underline that, and it takes a lot of effort to do this work, but that was at the basis. Afterwards, the process of getting our commitments through was very smooth, actually. The process of getting the implementation plan through, that was a bit more bumpy, but never about the commitment itself or what we have to do or whether it should be avoidance offsets or removals or whatever. That was quite clear once that story was told and understood. But it's about spreading the word and making people aware of the problem and of the scale of the problem.
I think for us, it really stemmed from the 2018 IPCC report, candidly. Like there are two main levers: stop emitting, remove carbon, and we weren't doing anything related to the second. And so if you have to do both, like we are going to need a portfolio of solutions, and that was a gap in Stripe's portfolio. And so, I think that when for us, what was important was grounding it in the science, grounding it in what experts had to say about the topic. And then from that, it became pretty clear. I think the piece that I think the piece that a lot of companies are sort of grappling with right now is what we were talking about earlier. How do we deal with the fact that on a per ton basis, the cost today is really, really high? And one way, without getting too deep into the weeds, I think one way to deal with this, and it's how we're starting to think about dealing with this in a more structural way going forward, is can you agree on a price per ton that you will pay for removals, but you can decouple that from the amount of tons you pay in that current year? So for example, if you say, we're going to pay, we want to remove the rest. Let's say you have, 100 tons that you need to remove, and we're going to charge ourselves $50 per ton. And we're going to take that total, bucket of money, about $50,000, and spend it on carbon removal. But you don't have to essentially purchase 100 tons. You can spend that money in the highest leverage way possible. And so if you decouple the year of investment from the year of return, that is one way that you can essentially allow yourselves to spend on the highest, what you believe is the highest impact removals, without necessarily sort of truing up on that accounting in a given year. That may be too detailed for this forum, but that's sort of one way that we've thought about it, which is sort of Just a
very quick follow up on that. When you talk about, I myself believe that much of this does come down to how, frankly, companies and sustainability funding is spent. Nan, did you happen to break the money apart into two pots and ring fence the two pots and say this pot is, do you know what I mean, for our sort of short-term inventory impact, but this pot, do you know what I mean, is for our levering the change impact? And did you apply different criteria? Do you see what I'm saying?
I think it depends on what you're like. So we're in the midst of sort of revising. Historically, Stripe has been carbon neutral, and we're in the midst of revising that program and haven't announced it yet. So I won't share too many details, but in short, emissions reduction and carbon removal should both be part of the strategy. And there are different ways that you can sort of instrument that effectively. But in short, both of those, like, pick a goal, understand your levers, and invest and aim to pull both of those in a way that you think is going to maximize climate impact, is the sort of principles.
I can only advise you to start with the price on the ton and then use that price wisely. It doesn't have to be that you then have only 15 or only 50 or only $100 per ton, but you can, because you have an amount of tons that you have to cover. So what we do is we take the best of the old world and transition by phasing out the best of the old world, which are good quality carbon avoidance credits. We phase those out and ramp up the good quality carbon removal credits. That's a story that we're going to tell. And the best of quality avoidance credits are still a lot cheaper than the best quality removal credits. So we take a few removal credits to begin with and go higher and higher by 2030 when our operational commitment is. And by then we'll have phased out the carbon avoidance offsets, and hopefully they stand on their own legs by then. It wouldn't be good if we now, starting next year, plug the carbon finance from all emission reduction projects that have been built up over the last 15 years. I don't think that it's a sensible thing to do, to just go and run for cheap removals, so to say. We should always keep quality in mind, and Swiss Re's approach is in fact exactly what you just said. We say we start with putting a price on carbon and then use that as an average dollar figure that we can spend on the average ton. But that means it allows us to spend a little bit on $600, $700, $800 per ton things, and we will have room to spend for $5, $6, $8, $10 per ton very high quality carbon offsets. So that's what we do basically, and we will manage to get that through as a plan, as a package, as a 10-year funding scheme, which also allows us then to enter 10-year off-taking agreements, because we know exactly how much we can collect from our internal carbon price of $100 over the 10 years. And over the 10 years, we let that price climb to $200, because we believe that by 2030, the average carbon removal ton will be around $200, the good quality stuff.
Maybe also to say a few words from the supply side when talking to customers or to corporates which implemented a strong strategy. The first thing we see that a company needs is a clear vision. They need to know in which direction they want to go. They need to have clear targets, also a clear date when they want to reach this target. The second thing corporates need to have a strong advocate inside the company who can also drive this process. I mean, Misha knows by heart how difficult it is to run such a project and how many hurdles you need to overcome in the company to convince the right people. And you need to have such a person to lead this process. And the third thing, and this is also important, it somehow needs to be related to the business case. It needs, if it's just a philanthropic topic, then sooner or later it will be stopped. So somehow it needs to be close. It needs the sustainability topic needs to get into the DNA of a company, into the core business. And if these three things are there, then we see that the company can be successful with net zero targets, also with implementing it. And this is also, Misha, what you said before. Claiming to become net zero is a different story than really becoming net zero. And from our perspective, if these three things are there, then companies are successful.
Okay. Daniel, I'm going to follow up with just one question for you, which is just on Climeworks' own particular offerings. It's a question I obviously am going to direct to you. What about them helps companies to overcome kind of internal objections or to build this particular business case? Should be a pretty easy question for you to answer.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on which of these three criteria are already met. When we see that there is no strong vision, then in the first case we need to see that this strong vision is created. Often as an outsider, and even if you're regarded as a supplier, this is really difficult to be made. So this definitely needs to come from inside. To have a strong advocate, so sometimes you simply need a couple of approaches to a company. So maybe you're not talking just to one person, you're talking to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different persons, so that you also can create a coalition. And this also sometimes helps, so that you're talking to different people and that you're forming a strong coalition inside the company to lead this topic. And then what you're coming to is to create a business case, and this becomes really individual depending on the company. It is, if, for example, as Nan pointed out before, it depends how you formulate impact, and this definition can be very, very difficult, very different, and you need to see that basically you can pay into this impact, and this you need to figure out. And then somehow it comes to the point that we're running discussions how this can be translated to offering for the customers. Also, just try out things. I mean, start with a couple of tons of CDR and try out different things, how this can be done. Run a pilot, for example, related to or connected with the existing product, and support the communication story, and then just see how their customers react on it. If it works, then we can start scaling it up, and if it doesn't work, then to try out different things. So, and this also means that we need to take away risk from the customers if something is not going to work, that they have invested a lot of money. So we basically can start with small volumes and just try it out and see where we end up. And taking away risk, I think this is one of the most important thing we can do, so that the investment, the upfront investment from a company is not too big.
Okay, thank you. I think we have about 15 minutes left. I've tried to sort of scan through the audience questions, and I'll start sort of throwing them at you, if that's all right. The first question I think I'm going to put to Jennifer. There have been at least, I think, 2 folks who have asked a bit about the contrast between sequestering carbon at point of capture, for example, in producing energy versus direct air capture. Could you just talk us through that, sort of the pros and cons of those 2 methods for the audience's sake, and I guess for my sake?
Sure. Yeah. So you know, I've done a lot of work in the space of looking at, you know, retrofitting facilities with carbon capture, and so avoiding the CO2 emissions in the first place. That's always going to be cheaper and easier to do because the CO2 is more concentrated. And you can look at different examples, like for instance, a natural gas-fired power plant has a CO2 concentration 100 times more concentrated than CO2 in the atmosphere. If you look at a cement plant, the exhaust could be 20 times that of the exhaust of a natural gas-fired power plant, so even more concentrated. And so those approaches are just cheaper and easier. And the technologies are a little bit different across each of those applications. But when you think about capturing from the atmosphere, it's more expensive, but there's benefits to that too, in that you do pay more today. But you could also minimize other costs like transportation costs. So you could site a direct air capture plant directly above or nearby where the CO2 will ultimately be sequestered, which means that you can kind of remove that cost, right? Because you can't decide that when you have a power plant that you're trying to deal with. The other piece I think that's important is that for a company like Climeworks, they can actually couple to low-grade heat. So the type of energy or thermal energy that they need to regenerate the material that they use for capture, they can couple to concentrated solar, they could couple to waste heat from industrial processes. And so that is interesting because it means that your capital expense could be decreased because you're piggybacking on something that's already been invested in. And so, you know, when you look at what Climeworks is doing, a lot of their, you know, cost reduction can be seen through that lens versus having to build something brand new or having to reduce the output of a power plant because you need the energy for the capture plant. And the other piece that I'll mention too, and I saw a question here in the chat, is not, you know, geologic storage doesn't exist everywhere. And so what do you do with the CO2? And something that's been missing from our conversation so far is sometimes considered a distraction, but I personally don't think it is. And that's the utilization of CO2. And so it's true that we often talk about carbon removal requires the CO2 to be permanently removed from the atmosphere, so often coupling it to geologic storage. Another topic is mineralization. It does not get a lot of attention because we just haven't been really doing it for as long as we've been doing dedicated storage, like putting CO2 in depleted oil and gas reservoirs. We know how to do that very well. Mineralization is earlier stage technology. Some cases it's maybe expensive, in other cases it may not be. But understanding where alkalinity sources are, so calcium and magnesium, that can be reactive to CO2 is a whole nother option. And so you don't have to just think about CO2 storage in depleted oil and gas reservoirs. You can also look at these other types of geologies and try to understand where they exist. And so the other aspect is that you have industrial byproduct waste too from the steel and cement industry. So like steel slag, cement kiln dust, these industrial byproducts are also reactive to CO2. And there are companies today that exist that are actually making synthetic aggregate. And so what that means is when you make concrete, and concrete, remember, has the ingredient of cement, and cement has a very high footprint today in terms of carbon, and it's one of those ones that's a hard to avoid sector. But synthetic aggregate could be used to offset the footprint of the concrete from that cement aspect. And so there are companies today that are using CO2 to make synthetic rock to go into concrete. And you can choose, where does that CO2 come from? Is it coming from avoided CO2 from a power plant, which is pretty cheap today? Or is it coming from the atmosphere? And so you can, depending on what energy resource you have available and what the situation looks like in terms of avoiding carbon or reducing carbon from the atmosphere, that's a whole nother area that I think is exciting and deserves attention, because the concrete market is gigatons of CO2 every year. And it's something that we don't give a lot of attention to.
Super helpful. I've grouped another bunch of, actually I'm gonna ask one audience question, maybe first to Misha, which is about whether or not, in essence, the continued interest in climate from ESG investment is actually having impact on this particular sort of, on, if you will, the removals market, if you perceive that or not. Maybe that's just a quick question to you before I move on.
Yes.
Do you want to say more than yes, sir, or is it just yes? I will say at BSR, we certainly, even in spite of the coronavirus pandemic, our observation also is that ESG interest in climate is undiminished. And I know that our financial services leads would say that, actually. But
and maybe, I mean, between the lines, I've heard it now from a couple of sides. Looks Stripe coming out with the commitment, followed by Shopify, Microsoft waking up and within a few weeks delivering on the plan that they released early January. BlackRock picking it up, Larry Fink bringing out the letter, talking to Satya from Microsoft. I mean, this is all kind of a bit connected as well. And now we have this avalanche, and I'm pretty sure there would have been an even bigger avalanche of commitments of people moving towards this net zero discussion, to the extent that the old world is pretty frightened and also a bit reluctant to go there. So I know of our old, offset suppliers, or I worked for a company in that space where it wasn't obvious to say, okay, what's the role of offsets or avoidance offsets in the future, and what's the role of removals, and who should do what, right? It's not that everybody goes to the new world and bingo, but who is doing what, and the same is a bit for investors, of course. I mean, they are more and more alert, and Larry Fink's letter did the rest about where the money goes and what is a safe asset and whatnot.
Yeah, we too have observed that that Larry Fink's annual letter has become more strident on climate, sort of year after year. Certainly by this year, it's quite explicit. I'm grouping 3 questions together next, 2 from the audience and 1 from me. The 2 questions from the audience are: how do you not alienate buyers of avoided emission offsets through this activity, and also what the role is of offset certifiers like Gold Standard? So those are the 2 audience questions. The question I would add is, because we know that the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets is undergoing its work right now and will probably complete it in Q1 of 2021, I guess my question would be, if you were speaking to them, if you were saying to this task force, whose role is in effect to try and scale up the voluntary carbon market, including on removals, what would you say to them if you could ask them to do something to ensure good quality removal offsets sort of scaled up? Those are 3 questions that I think are sort of related. I'm sorry, you're free to tackle whichever one you want. But again, just how you don't alienate buyers of avoided emission offsets, what you think the role of offset certifiers like Gold Standard is, and then sort of related, if you had something to say to the task force folks, if they were on the line today, and they have an interest in scaling up this particular market, what would you tell them?
I can take this one first. I mean, to your last question, I mean, if you ask me as a sales guy, then I would say, hey guys, there's a huge opportunity in front of you. I mean, this is an area which is not covered yet, and you have the chance to get in. Said in other words, I mean, there is in the moment there is no standards covering what we are doing, and we need an independent body taking care of that. And the established bodies like for example Gold Standard, they can jump in. I mean, they have the credibility and they also have the capability to do so. And I think for them it's also a big chance. Of course, it's if you look what they have done in the past, it's a shift in a bit a shift in their mindset might be, but it's also, I mean, the world is turning, and they also need to adapt to this future world of net zero and on removals. And I think today it's time to do so. And this is what I would reply to them from a market perspective. And I mean, from a technical perspective, I think this is simply something we need to do together. We need to participate as a supplier. We need to have the scientific community as the experts like Jen, and we also need the demand side explaining them what kind of certificates they expect. And this is again, this is a community approach and not something one person or one organization can do by itself.
Super. Other comments on this this area of questions on buyers and offsets?
It needs all. Okay, it's really not okay to say now everybody running somewhere. Okay, what we should stop do is nothing. Okay, don't do nothing. Do reduce in your own value chain. Do buy offsets if you consider that to be your strategy or your vision, or do buy removals if you set yourself a net zero target. What you should not do as well is don't say you have a net zero target and reach that by avoidance offsets. I don't think that works, because your emissions are in the atmosphere and they stay there. And the fact that you paid somebody else to avoid his or her emissions, right? I mean, in the absence of that action, you would have 2 emissions in the atmosphere. But still, if you do it, your emission is still in the atmosphere. So consider that if you talk net zero, that you should also talk carbon removal. That's the only thing I say. But I don't say now everybody go there, right? I can completely acknowledge that people have good reasons to still support all sorts of actions, from reductions in your own supply chain or reductions somewhere else, or that's all good.
Well, now, Jennifer, do you want to add anything? It's up to you. All right, so I think we have about 5 minutes remaining. What I'd love to do is I'd love to give each of you a minute to just to make some concluding remarks. I would like to ask Nina, sort of our live drawing artist, to show on screen what has been drawn so far. It is really fascinating to do this in a virtual environment. But in any case, Nina, can I ask you to do that? And then whichever of the 4 of you would like to go first. I will actually ask that Daniel go last, just as the host of the event for the very last minute. But first, Nina. Let's see if we've got this up. We can definitely see your screen. Interesting. Can you make that full screen? Super. Thank you. Wow, inclusive of like figures of the 5 of us, I suppose. So, with that, Misha, Jennifer, and Ann, which of you would like to go first for your sort of concluding remarks?
I'm happy to kick it off. So I think I will plug a couple of things as my concluding remarks. So some of you might know that we started a new journal on negative emissions last year, and we have a couple of really exciting research themes. Personally, I mean, I'll never stop being an educator in this space. That's just really what my role is personally. And so I feel like in order to get to gigatons by mid-century, we need more human capital. We need to educate more people in the space of policy, in the space of new technologies, new companies, in the space of deployment, in the spaces of philanthropy. I mean, the list goes on. And so this journal that we started in December last year, it was first launched, we have a number of research themes right now. One of them is actually, it's an open access journal I'll mention. And so one of our research themes is sponsored by Stripe, which is super exciting. Thanks, Nan, for that. And it pays for the open access fees for the publications. And so that one in particular is we've been asking tech companies and Climeworks is submitting something. So thank you, Daniel. And we're asking companies to, especially those that have been in the trenches for the last decade or more, in the carbon removal space in particular, what is their perspective on what it's going to take in terms of how can we leverage philanthropy dollars? How can we leverage investors? How can we leverage buyers? How can we leverage policy in order to deploy negative emissions or removals at the gigaton scale by mid-century to meet climate goals? And we sent an invite out to 120. We've got 30 that said yes so far. So super excited about that. And there's a ton of others in terms of research themes that we've got. So if you're interested, please go to Frontiers Negative Emissions Journal, and you can find all of that. The other piece that we're working on is a book. It's the first of a kind again, but I am not the sole author. There are 40 of us from North America and Europe, and it's going to be the first of a kind primer, a CDR primer. And it will be released by the new year, and it will be open access online, and super excited about that too. So stay tuned. And if you're interested, there's going to be an accompanied hard copy too that'll come out, and we'll take orders, you know, soon. But if you're interested, send me an email, and I can make sure you're on the list to get the first preview. So those are some things. And I think ultimately, you know, the final message is just to keep an open mind on all of this and recognize that each of these topics are going to be required in order to meet climate goals. And there is no silver bullet solution. We need it all.
I will happily make the CDR primer required reading for my team over here. But in any case, I am going to give a minute over to Misha and a minute over to Nan before Daniel takes us home.
Yeah, I think I said a lot. So there are so many good reasons to act currently and to basically, you know, do corporate climate action, but consider also the co-benefits that you will achieve. So the nature-based solutions, for example, for carbon removal, they came a bit short in this discussion, but keep in mind also there and with the avoidance world, I don't want to have anybody play against each other. If it's not for the sake of climate protection, there are plenty of good reasons to go for many of those reduction projects that are out there, or to go for those nature-based solutions that add resilience or improve our food and do all the other great benefits. So keep that in mind. It's not against each other, it's always together with each other.
Nan?
Yep, well said. I think, you know, to conclude, I would just say that businesses can play a really big role in changing the course of both carbon removal and emissions reduction. I think there's a huge opportunity here. And we've talked today a lot about the importance of carbon removal in addition to emissions reduction. One of the things that, you know, we at Stripe have been really encouraged by is getting outreach from a lot of businesses who want to do something in carbon removal, but haven't because it's complicated, it's hard to figure out what to do. And we're currently working to make it much easier for any business of any size to do something impactful in carbon removal. If this is something that you're interested in, would love to hear from you and talk more. Feel free to shoot me an email, but yeah, I think we at Stripe are very optimistic that businesses can change their trajectory on climate generally, and very much so on carbon removal as well.
Super. Daniel, you have the last word.
Yeah, first of all, thanks to all of you for participating, and also David for leading this session, and also thank you very much for all the people in the audience. We do have a clear target. I mean, and Misha said this: we need to be carbon neutral by mid of this century, and we need to be carbon negative in the second half of this century. This seems to be a big challenge. It definitely is, but it is also we have a lot of opportunities, and I think this is the way how we need to see it, as opportunities. And we also need to be aware that there are different solutions or different ways how we can reach these targets. Today, we do not know yet which one will be successful, and this is also why we wanted to have people here presenting different ways how to approach this challenge. And I hope that we achieve this target, that we could show different ways how to do that. And at the end, I agree with Misha. We need to do it together. I mean, it's our world. We have to collaborate, and we simply have to achieve that. And from this perspective, I want to be optimistic on that, and I would like to see it as opportunity. And I think this is also the case. So thanks a lot to all of you, and I hope you enjoyed the session.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye,
Thanks again.
everyone.
Take care, everybody. All
Bye-bye.
right. Take care. Bye.